Tabcorp's Materiality journey with Socialsuite. So just as a bit of housekeeping before we kick things off, you'll notice the chat box on the right-hand side. Feel free to sort of punch in any questions in there. We might address them as we go through the webinar. However, we'll leave a bit of time at the end for Q&A to go through those questions as well. So yeah, don't be shy in the chat box. In terms of the purpose of today's webinar, we get a lot of feedback from organizations that we speak to, and speaking to a lot of sustainability professionals that they generally understand the concept of materiality and why it's important, but being able to really articulate the value that that process can bring back and tie into your organization, to also then bring the rest of the exec team, the board, also on that journey and integrate that into the strategy, I think is a little bit of an area which is missing. So hopefully, bring another organization onto this webinar can just help understand that from their perspective and get some good insights from that as well. For those that are unfamiliar with Socialsuite, we are a sustainability technology and advisory company, and we have a core focus around materiality, so help a range of organizations, ASX listed and private companies through this process. And really, as part of this sort of webinar series, we're really interested in getting a lot of feedback, providing some value back to the market in terms of areas that you want to learn about as well. So we will send out the recording of this session post the webinar, but we do also house them both on our website, but also on our YouTube channel as well. So if you do miss the live session, feel free to jump into those resources. But to help navigate today's discussion, we're kindly joined by, first of all, Dr. Tim Siegenbeek van Heukelom, who is the Chief Impact Officer at Socialsuite. And also one of our favorite clients to work with is Renata Lopez, who is the Head of Sustainability at Tabcorp as well. So without further ado, I'll hand across to yourself, Tim.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom, for that introduction, and welcome, Renata. It's great to have you here on the webinar today. Looking forward to really unpack with you that materiality journey over 2024. To do that today, what we'd like to do is really quickly kind of introduce materiality, but at a very high level, and how that is relevant to Tabcorp and what Tabcorp's requirements are around materiality. So we'll spend not too much time on that because we really want to dig into that journey today. So we're going to go through that, process this year and really unpack that together. And then we'll end the session today with some key takeaways, the lessons, and some advice for other organizations when you start thinking about your first materiality assessment or enhancing the process you already have in place. What can you learn? Some kind of real world examples and lessons there. So with that, first, really quickly, for the people that are not that familiar with the concept of materiality or in relation to sustainability, what we're looking at when we think about materiality or materiality assessments is really about identifying the most significant sustainability issues that are impacting the company and its stakeholders. So when we think about the company, we think about what are the risks and opportunities relating to sustainability. And when we think about the stakeholders, we really think about at large, the world, planet, society, what are the impacts you're having? So if we pull that apart a little bit and look under there, then what we see is there are really two perspectives there. On the one hand, as I said, there's the impacts you're having. People generally call that impact materiality. So how is your company positively or negatively impacting society and the environment? And equally, what are the sustainability related risks and opportunities that can affect your company's financial performance? So those two perspectives together are generally called double materiality. And that concept now, more and more companies are now looking at, when they look at a materiality assessment, they'll look at both of those perspectives there together in a double materiality assessment. Now, with that, it always helps to make that concept a bit clearer. So I'm really at a high level here to just kind of, see how that could potentially fit an organization like Tabcorp. If we're to look at some of the key kind of the main activities there and look at the impact side there, then if we see that the main kind of, products and services around gambling, there always are at a high level potential negative and positive impacts you can have. So it's always good to really start thinking from that sustainability point of view. How do we impact the world, or how do we, in this case, impact people? Well, it could put financial strain on people, or, it could negatively influence mental health. But also positively, it could create jobs, drives tax income, could create business through licensing. So there's all these impacts you're having. And if we look at the bottom there around sustainability topics on responsible products and how you deliver that to people, how you link to customer welfare, how are you impacting economically on the communities and societies around you. Likewise, if we look at financial materiality, then we could think about what are some of the key things that are happening right now that could potentially, create a risk or an opportunity. Now, we know in Australia, there's been a lot of talk about the gambling advertising ban, which is a potential risk for an organization like Tabcorp when you think about potentially revenue loss or brand visibility. But equally, you could also look at the opportunities around that. If you are through that, looking at your sustainability topic about responsible marketing and advertising, you could be seen as a more ethical and social company and really drive your reputation that way. Also, you might be looking at innovation, like how can you bring your product and services better to market there, and what are the opportunities related to that? So this is just at a high level how materiality works. To jump into that a bit more, I think it's always useful to think about the impacts, risks, opportunities, and the topics, and how does an organization actually use that knowledge there? If you do know what the most important areas are and where your impacts and risks and opportunities reside across your business activities, how does that help you? A lot of organizations use it for a strategic purpose, for a more operational, practical purpose on what they do around sustainability, but as well to inform their reporting. With that in mind, Renata, maybe kind of taking a step back there, I'd love to kind of learn a bit more, prior to, us working together, Tabcorp and Socialsuite. So let's say the end of 2023, early 24, where was the organization in terms of their sustainability journey and their, previous thinking around materiality?
Yeah, so we, after the demerger of the Keno and lottery business, we actually looked at what are the most important issues to our stakeholders and to our business in the lenses of the new organization, right? Just in terms of gambling without the separate lotteries and Keno. So that gave us an opportunity to have a look at the future strategy, the risks that we had just by having a more niche operations in terms of gambling and racing and media as well. So we actually, at the time, we just did a desktop materiality assessment using the GRI guidelines, but it did involve some stakeholders, internal stakeholders in particular, with external involved, conversations with investors, conversations with regulators, but it wasn't much. So it was basically, like I said, a desktop review, conversations here and there, but it probably wasn't as structured as the journey that we had with Socialsuite, because I think that the challenge sometimes is not just doing the work, but also documenting the whole process. And after documenting the process, going through surveys, filtering all the results and developing the material for a validation workshop. So I guess it was a process that was more in-house. It was much simpler, but perhaps it wasn't as engaging. So I think that what we wanted to do moving forward, in particular with new standards coming and with the role of the auditing of a sustainability report, was just to have something that was a little bit more robust, but being more efficient, but also keeping the costs down, so being cost effective as well. So I guess the difference between the way that we were doing things to the way that we did this time, it was definitely ticking those boxes. So, being audit ready, cost effective, and more efficient for us. And I think the results will be extremely helpful for us, not just in terms of last year's report. If you have a look at what we reported the year prior to last year, there was a massive improvement. But also the results are very helpful for us to have a look at our strategy, refresh our strategy, but also make reporting better, and also help us internally with business cases, because then we actually have the results of a process that was a more robust process. And then when we take those results to the ELT and to the board with different initiatives that we want to do, we can actually use that to validate our thinking.
I think you touched upon a lot of value here, and just to pick out a few of the highlights. What I heard was really kind of useful, where we see some organizations use the materiality assessment just to inform their reporting on disclosure. But what you flagged here now as well is really informing the strategy, like what are we really focusing on strategically? How does it then translate in, these sustainability initiatives that we really focus on, not operational side. And then of course there's the reporting. And the other component, which is really becoming, to your point, a lot more important, whereas let's say 5 to 10 years ago, if a company did a materiality assessment, it was all about the outcomes. It is now almost like the outcomes are as important as the process itself, because that needs to be audited. How did you get to the outcomes? Can you explain that? Can you, have you documented that? What were the decision points that were made? So it's almost like in school when, you get a maths equation and you got the answer and the teacher's like, how do you get to it? That's really where materiality is going to. And we see that in particular in jurisdictions like what we see now in Europe with CSRD, where a double materiality assessment is mandated. There's so much attention around the assurance around that materiality assessment. So that's some really great insights. You already touched on some of these areas there as well, and the improvement going forward, and that's what we see a lot of organizations do as well. And they really kind of year over year try to pick up a few areas in the materiality work and improve that. To your point, with keeping the costs down and really kind of being smart about what are some of the things we can do a bit better, and how can we enhance our process. Already flagged that initially it was really more of a GRI focused impact materiality assessment. By adding that, the double materiality perspective, you get a lot more insights there across those impact, risk, and opportunities. And one of the things you picked out, I think, as well, is about the actual engagement. We see a lot of organizations, they look at what are the best ways to engage both internally with your team, get them on board, but also get their views, and then go external. And how do you do that in an efficient manner that's not putting too much time, effort, resources, and burden on a team? The other one I think that I want to unpack a bit further is the traditionally we see a lot of organizations have framed the materiality assessment as this like project. It's a month we have to do this as a little sprint, and that's sometime in the year that needs to happen. But it's really kind of, all systems go, it needs to be done. And suddenly you see there's this massive kind of, workload suddenly. Whereas what we see now happening is that organizations are rethinking that and saying, can we use some of the existing data and information we have already that we collect throughout the year and go from the sprint to, like, let's call it a more paced marathon, where throughout the year we do these little exercises and we collect the data so that by the time we need the outcomes from the materiality assessment, everything's been collected, documented, validated, and we only have to compile it, do the analysis and compilation. So what is your view on that? We'll look at a little bit of the journey a little later. Have you seen that kind of as well, that move?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're spot on. It was usually one of those things that we would do, okay, let's say March or very early in the year, we would go through all the different information sources that we had, investors' feedback, regulators' feedback, do a scan of our rating agencies and all those different bits and pieces, and just put together in a PowerPoint. And then have a conversation here and there, internally, externally, but it wasn't really, it was basically during that period of time, which can be almost a little bit stressful, because you are just trying to, like you said, you have to sprint, right? Rather than have that during certain times of the year. So I think the way that we did last time, with Socialsuite was very helpful, because then we could work out different times of the year that would work with different bits and pieces. So with internal survey, with external survey, with the external interviews. So I think that this way it was almost seamless to us. It worked well by doing bit by bit rather than just doing everything at the same time. Helpful to have all the data that we had to help this, with the conversation, and also engaging everyone in the organization and engaging external as well. And I think that what I've found was that by going through a more detailed process, we actually had better engagement, not just internally, but externally as well. So the feedback that we got was really good.
Yeah, and I do agree. We saw some really rich insights there, and all those, and we'll look at that in a moment as well, but all those insights that you collect over the year and the existing data you might already have lead to a much better full analysis. So you really have, a lot more rich insight. But then what we often see and hear from organizations is that even if they manage to collect, pretty diverse and good data set, doing that analysis in spreadsheets can be, quite daunting. So that's something as well that we were looking at, like how can we help with our software to automate that and really enter qualitative data, translate that to quantitative data sets, and get some real insights out of that and scores that we can then compare and inform with an internal discussion on the validation of the materiality of particular topics. So with that, I think you already flagged there were some key points in that process throughout 24, and I thought it would be really useful to just kind of visualize that a little bit and demonstrate that the sprint, moving towards a marathon there. So early in the year, there was a lot of information you already had collected. There was already there, or that in that first quarter around the desk review. And we see a lot of organizations already have information. They have data that they have from either industry reviews or investors or otherwise. These are important data sets we'd like to feed into a full assessment. So with that informed the setup for that first survey, which we conducted with you kind of that April-May timeframe there to look at what internally, what's the pulse check, what do we feel based on the information we have, what are the internal views. That moved then a bit later in the year with the learnings out of that first survey to a second survey, which had internal and external engagement, and also followed up with some of the key stakeholders, external stakeholders out of that second survey to go a lot deeper into interview. So really pick a few key stakeholders that had good answers and really kind of dig a bit deeper there to get that more qualitative insight. Now, all that information then was ultimately analyzed in October in our platform. And with that, and I think that's one of the key things I'd like to pick up on, which is really interesting, is that a lot of organizations have the data, they listen to their stakeholders, and they take whatever the stakeholders say for granted. But it's really important to really kind of weigh that information, compare that information, and internally have that discussion and validation around that. We'll look at that in a moment as well in a bit more detail, but I found that process really useful. But as Tom earlier flagged in the introduction, is that a lot of organizations struggle with sustainability engagement internally. How do you deal with that within Tabcorp? Like, how do you, as the head of sustainability, how have you educated and gotten people around you cross-functionally on board with helping you in that journey? What are some of the tips, tricks, and learnings around that?
Look, I probably feel bad because I'm lucky that we have such a good team that is actually interested in sustainability. So I think that helps. But I guess it just when I'm having conversations with other departments, it's more about learning how they do things at the moment and how they can actually incorporate sustainability in their practice without creating that burden. So basically, incorporating as a business as usual process. So, if it's a procurement process, rather than sending, a few different surveys, how can we actually utilize your existing survey to have 1, 2, or 3 different topics that we need? So I think that by having this approach, and again, like I said, I'm very lucky that we have a team that is really passionate about sustainability, in the different areas that they have their influence. It is definitely helpful. The tone from the top actually helps as well. So we have a board risk compliance and sustainability committee that we report every quarter. So the team actually knows that all the work that we're doing needs to be reported every quarter. And I guess they understand that with this work that we do, with the materiality assessment, it helps the organization, but also it helps the individual teams, because if they do need to do business cases for different things, they know that this piece of work, it's actually helpful for them, because they can say, you know, they can justify the why are we doing certain things. And like I said, I think that if I look back in the past, we basically have that quantitative information by having, the qualitative, but then being able to quantify, it actually adds that extra layer to the equation, which is very helpful when we talk to the LT and to directors and with different audience as well. So your CFO will likely be more appreciative to have that quantitative information there in hand.
Yeah, and really key thing that you flagged there, and what we see is that embedding sustainability throughout the business. That's something we hear, you know, quite kind of lately from a lot of organizations that say the key with sustainability is not to build a massive team. The key with sustainability is actually what you just explained, is making sure that business functions and departments think about their day-to-day, their business as usual, but with a sustainability head-on or perspective. So if they're doing something, is there a way to do it greener, cleaner, more efficient, or in a materiality case, what information can I already learn with this ongoing engagement with a stakeholder? So it's about embedding that throughout the business. So you need sustainability aware people and advocates throughout the business in different departments. So you don't need a big team, as long as everyone is aware and is helping you. It's almost the same if you think about finance. You don't need a massive finance team. You need a good core team, but every department will have their budget and their budget line. And they need to be aware that they're not overspending, and they need to keep that head on all the time when they do things. Sustainability is very similar. So it's great to hear that that is a real kind of way of implementing that throughout the business. And one of the things that you flagged earlier, after that first materiality assessment early in the year, you know, that straight away fed into the Tabcorp Sustainability Report 2024. So it was a really good starting point. But with that as well, as we just saw in the previous slide, it didn't stop there. And I think that's that message of the sprint, turning that into a marathon. Build on what you have and what you know, get new data in there, and really build that data set to learn a lot more, you know, across your journey. One of the other things I thought was really useful is when we talk about our data set here, you already flagged there's a lot of information that was brought to the game basically in the assessment. And it's really about getting all that information together. And sometimes people think about materiality assessment as, that means doing a survey and that's the end of it. But I think Tabcorp has really shown here that it is about all these things. It is about indeed getting views from your internal and external stakeholders through surveys and interviews, but also really having that existing engagement already with investors and learning what their priorities and insights are. What can you learn from the priority of rating agencies and how they rate you? What are your proxy advisor insights that you've learned there? Competitive analysis. You know, there's a lot to learn from media coverage as well, and some key industry insights. And bringing all that together is really kind of a key component there. In our platform, you know, we like we said, we do all that analysis there, and that ultimately then kind of leads to a set of preliminary material topics. And this is what I flagged a bit earlier, is that, you know, yes, you might get this with a score out of the platform when all the numbers are crunched there, but ultimately this is now ready for discussion and validation. And I found that that was something that was really kind of where your team really engaged throughout that journey. Was they looked at this and said, like, let's have that discussion now. What does each of these topics really mean to the business? And by going through those insights there, there's one thing that really stood out, which I thought was really good that the team kind of really picked up on. Like, every topic was discussed. Why do my stakeholders and my data put it at a certain place in that matrix there, or with a certain score? But there's always blind spots. And in this case, it was really kind of, you know, pretty obvious. And it was picked up, I think, by the finance team really quickly, was that If we look at the topics there at the bottom, at 24, 25 in red there, they were from a stakeholder point of view, pretty low on impact, and even on financial materiality, pretty low. You would say they didn't make the cut in that sense from a stakeholder, from a data input view. But we all know that in Australia, the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards have been announced. They're going live the 1st of January. That means that GHG emissions reporting, climate disclosures are becoming compliance. So it's really something to keep in mind there, that you need to do that work. So for many organizations, that is financially material. You need to just do that work there. But at large, stakeholders might not have caught up with that idea. They're not sure yet when that comes in. So you might see from stakeholder views, they say, well, really for Tabcorp, we believe responsible products, marketing, advertising, that's top of mind, not so much GHG emissions. But the business then in a validation session might say, well, really, we really think about it with everything we know, those topics are material to us. So that session was really kind of, I think, worthwhile and valuable to see that engagement from the team as well. What is your reflection on that process, Renata?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think it was extremely helpful, and I think that for two reasons: one, to validate the result, but also in terms of engaging the in particular our ELT, right? Because then it just makes so much easier when we actually take this work to the board, because usually we go through the executive team, for the risk compliance and sustainability committee. We go to the executive team before we actually go to the board, and just basically for everything for endorsement, and just having that presence in the validation workshop to actually look at what we've done, how we got there, and having their feedback into whether or not the results are okay, should be adjusted. I think that's helpful, and it brings the engagement. It just brings people a little bit closer. It's one thing to go and present a piece of work that we do to the OT, but then it's a different thing just to go and say, hey, this is the work that we have done, and by the way, this person and this person were actually in the workshop as well. So it was helpful, I think, that for those two points of view. One, it was great to see them engaged, but to them be that advocate to say, yep, we were part of this work, and the work was actually quite robust. What we have there, the results that we have are actually, we fully endorse it because we were part of it. So I think that was very helpful.
Yeah, I think, like what you're flagging there, like I think that sense of ownership, being part of the process, and really that really made a difference. Now looking back on that, I guess the whole journey and working with Socialsuite on that, what is your reflections there on, I think, the engagement, the process, the outcomes? If you take that step back, what are your views?
Look, I think that the surveys made very easy just to have that first engagement with the team internally back when we first started. Then with the second survey, we actually have that a little bit broader. So we brought the external audience as well. It was helpful. The interview, it just made much easier, because I think that it's so much easier for people to talk to someone who is not affiliated to the company that you are surveying about it. So I think that it brought a lot of good insights for us. And the feedback that we actually had afterwards was very positive, right? So I think that it did engage our external audience, but also internally, when we started to talk to people about the surveys, the interviews, and the whole process, I think it was just one, it was also an excuse for us to get a little bit closer to the team in sustainability and explain what the materiality assessment is. Because I think a lot of people, like you mentioned before, a lot of people in the organizations, they kind of know what a materiality assessment is. They might not know in too much detail, but they have heard of it. they might have an understanding. So I think it was a good excuse to explain and engage them in this process. I think that the process around pacing ourselves through the year rather than just sprinting was very helpful as well. I think it just made things easier because we didn't have to rush to have everything done at once. And we were able to actually work around what time was better for each of the teams and also for our external stakeholders. So that was actually something that, we learned that moving forward, it's something that we need to consider as well. And in terms of outcomes, we got a really good report outlining, well, basically documenting the whole process, which is great. It was great for our reporting. So I think that our sustainability report, the way that we report on materiality was much better. The quality was much better this year. I guess the results will actually be extremely helpful to put those business case forward, to refresh our strategy moving forward, but also that piece around auditing, right? Assurance. It's just something that now we do have a very robust report that can explain the whole process, our approach, and everything. So I think that they are the key things that I can think of.
Now, thanks for sharing those insights. That's really, really valuable. And then maybe, if we think about, there's the lessons for other organizations that are considering to run their first or improve on the process they already have in place in terms of their materiality assessments. We spoke already about that, the sprint versus the marathons. I think that's pretty clear there. I think one of the things that we really flagged as well is that building that internal support, like really driving sustainability to embed that throughout the business there. And early we touched upon the single versus double materiality. I think most organizations are considering that, like where are they at the moment, what is required? And sometimes they look at legislation, sometimes they look at their stakeholders, what are they demanding in terms of the approaches there. Then around budget and resource, you flagged that at the start as well. It's about like how much time and money do you actually have to do this work there. The next one then on stakeholder engagement, we flagged on that, the different ways to engage internally and externally, and then the way software can support that whole process. So really kind of having a dedicated function and functionality to do surveys, interviews, but also bring all that data then together. What are your kind of thinking about these areas? If there's an organization that says, well, I want to run my first materiality assessment, what are your lessons and advice to them?
Look, I would say don't be afraid of asking for help externally. I know that we have, as sustainability professionals, sometimes we know that there are some budget restrictions and we want to do a lot of things ourselves. But I think that, I personally found it was a very cost-effective way to do it, and it was very efficient. So it saved us a lot of time and built a lot of engagement. I mentioned that before, but I think that it makes so much easier when you have a third party that actually has that knowledge and bring the external perspective as well. I almost have the feeling that sometimes people get a bit, bored of just listening to the same person all the time. So it's good to bring fresh eyes and a fresh approach to the way that we do things. The software was just, very easy to collate data and to get insights, and you do get a lot of extra comments as well that are extremely helpful there. We had a lot of support, the whole way. And I think in the past, we've looked at different ways that we could do things, and we had a look at different consultants. And we were just in shock of the prices we were charging. So I think that when we came across Socialsuite, it was basically what we were looking for, something that's simple, something that's cost effective. You still have the support in there. So I personally felt that we were supported in every step of the way. So from setting up the surveys, what were the things that we need to think about it, any additional questions, tips from other clients. So I actually think it's something to consider. I think that for us, it was a really good experience. At the time, I didn't know what we were there for, to be honest, because I never actually came across something like this platform. So I think I would say by the end of the process, I was like, okay, well, that's exactly what I was looking for. So I was extremely happy. So I think that perhaps the biggest advice for me is just have a look at what you wanted to achieve. Like for us was something simple, something cost effective, something efficient, something that we could document and be audit ready. And I think I got that. So yeah, my advice is have a look around and, you know, be curious, because I think that for us, it was worth it.
Thanks for sharing that. And that's, I think, yeah, indeed, a lot of organizations are thinking about, like, what do I actually need? I think that's always the first step to start with. Like, get your goals and objectives clear, get your resources, your time clear, and then, you know, talk to people and see what the options are. Now, with that, then I want to invite Tom back to the stage and see if there's any questions that have come in for myself or Renata around the materiality process, or how Tabcorp has gone through that process. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Tim, and yeah, thanks, Renata. I think you have some really valuable insights. You mentioned about the report that Tabcorp have just released as well. So I think in the follow-up email that we send out, the webinar recording, we'll also share that recent report. And I think it'll give organizations a good example of the great work that you're doing at Tabcorp, but also the materiality sort of component in particular. As Tim said, we'd welcome any questions, whether it be for Renata in terms of her experience and how we approach things, or whether it be or from a Socialsuite perspective, and yeah, happy to ask any questions. But if not, we can wrap things up there. As I said, we'll follow up with an email of the recording, the slide deck, and also the Tabcorp report. Okay, we've got a question in. So Catherine, thank you. So you noted that people within an organization may not all be at the same point, i.e. understanding expectations on sustainability. So Socialsuite looks like a good tool. How have you tackled the issue of, I don't see why we need to do materiality assessment, and how do you articulate the value? Good question.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. I guess it's one of those things that when we talk about financial materiality, people can get it, can understand it, because they can kind of quantify. I think that with sustainability, when we talk about materiality from a sustainability lens, it's very similar, but it's a little bit broader, right? Because it just takes into consideration so many other bits and pieces from the whole organization, but also the external environment. So I think that, you know, the way I like to see it, and I have a background in legal. So for me, it was always, okay, well, with compliance, which everyone kind of understands it's important, risk and compliance, right? You usually need to look at compliance issues as it is now, right? I think that with sustainability, I take a very similar approach, but it's more around future-proofing your organization. So if you look at the way, if you do a screening, which, you know, through a materiality assessment, it's a good way to do that screening for what is happening now, but also what is coming in the future. I think that you can see the value because you can get prepared. So, for example, with the new Australian standards for sustainable reporting, we could see that coming for, you know, a number of years now, like 4 or 5 years. There was talk already that was coming. So if the organization was, looking at it and is starting to consider, okay, well, this may become law. So it gives them the opportunity to, like I said, to future-proof and put all the different resources in place and processes in place. So the way that I see with the materiality assessment, I guess it just gives an opportunity to have a look at what is important to the organization, but also to your stakeholders, not just now, but also in the future. So I think it's a good way to have that information to inform your strategy. So not just so much the reporting, but also your strategy and what you can actually put in place now to future-proof your organization to what is coming in the coming years. It might be regulatory, it might be in terms of risks. So I think it just puts you in a good place to guide your strategy moving forward.
Great insight. And I would say, I think that point you make there about the regulation coming into place. We see that materiality assessments in Europe, in the EU, under the CSRD are mandated. Every year, organizations that fall under that regulation need to do a double materiality assessment because it does inform the groundwork, the start of your sustainability reporting work, strategy. And we see that now in Australia slowly coming as well. You now need to understand your climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, there's also a voluntary standard coming in that actually, if you look at that standard, that is effectively a financial materiality, sustainability-related materiality assessment. Now, that is voluntary, but that will, over time, become a mandated process most likely as well. We see other jurisdictions where that is already mandated. So with an eye on that, you're really getting ready for incoming regulation, but at the same time, by understanding what is material really clearly, that is what investors are looking for. They want investor-grade data that is relevant, the most relevant data, material data. They don't want anything else. And through that assessment, you really ensure that there are no blind spots, there are not areas that you've missed, but also by doing that exercise, you really engage your stakeholders. And that's often a key component people forget about. They're just thinking about what are the outcomes of the assessment, but it's the process as well. And that's why that documenting the process and the assurance around the process is so important. You need to really kind of engage with your stakeholders internally and externally, because they will actually give you all that information to see what is relevant to your strategy, to your operations, and to your reporting. So that, in terms of how do you articulate the value, it's having those conversations with the board, with executive, and sometimes, maybe to your point, Renata, it does help to bring a third party in. Like sometimes it can be hard in an organization to keep on pressing with something and no one listens. And if you get an external expert in and get them to talk about the value or the importance of something, everyone suddenly listens up. So there are some strategies around that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Renata. I think you touched on a point as well, Renata, in terms of it depends on the stakeholder that you're speaking to as well and trying to put it in their language of what their world means. So if you're speaking to a CFO and you're trying to get their buy-in, then it could be looking at from that financial and that risk perspective in terms of how it impacts sort of their world. So yeah, really good question, Catherine. I think you might be worth a follow-up conversation. We could reach out and sort of help you with some material on how to approach that conversation internally. Any other questions? I'll just leave it 10 seconds or so if anyone's got any more questions. Don't think anything's coming through, but if anything comes to mind, feel free to respond to the email that we'll send out afterwards, or feel free to connect with Renata, Tim, or myself on LinkedIn, any questions at all. But Renata, thank you again for joining us on this webinar. And Tim, thanks always, some really valuable insights. So thank you else for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you.